Homo erectus, the first humans to leave Africa. This is the story of a human species that walked out of Africa nearly 2 million years ago, spread across 3 continents, outlasted every other member of our genus, and then vanished, leaving behind bones, stone tools, and more open questions than the fossil record has ever answered about any single species. Homo erectus were the first humans to leave Africa, and almost everything scientists thought they knew about them keeps getting rewritten. Before we get to where they went, we need to understand what kind of creature was actually making that journey. Homo erectus which translates directly as upright human, showed up in the African fossil record around 2 million years ago. And from the very beginning, they stood apart from everything that came before. Their predecessors, species like Homo habilis were smaller and more ape-proportioned, with shorter legs and longer arms, shaped as much for climbing as for walking. Homo erectus changed that blueprint completely, and the changes were structural and deliberate in the way evolution produces deliberate things. Elongated legs, shorter arms, a torso built for covering ground rather than gripping branches. For the first time in the history of our lineage, a hominin existed whose body proportions would not look wildly out of place. Standing next to a modern human, height ranged from about 4 feet 9 inches to 6 feet 1 inch. Weight ran between roughly 41 and 65 kilograms, and the musculature was dense and built for a physically demanding life. The skull was another matter entirely, long and low, shaped like a football when viewed from the side. The Homo erectus head featured a receding forehead, massive brow ridges hanging over the eyes like a shelf, a squared-off ridge at the back called an occipital torus, and cranial bones considerably thicker than anything in a modern human skull. Tucked inside that thick casing sat a brain averaging around 900 cubic centimeters, larger than Homo habilis had managed, but well short of the modern human average of about 1,350 cubic centimeters. Smaller brain, thicker bones. That body, though, was ready for the world, and they used it. Nearly 2 million years. That's how long Homo erectus existed, and it's a number worth letting settle before moving on. Homo sapiens have been around for roughly 300,000 years, and in that time we've developed writing, electricity, and remade the planet's surface. Homo erectus walked this Earth for nearly 2 million of them, which makes them the longest surviving member of the genus Homo in the entire fossil record, by a distance that has no close competitor. For the vast majority of that time, they were spreading across territory no hominin had ever entered, adapting to climates and landscapes that had no precedent in their evolutionary history, and leaving evidence of their presence from East Africa to the Indonesian archipelago. That track record reframes what Homo erectus actually were. Not a failed experiment, not a footnote between Homo habilis and us. One of the most successful large-brained primates ever to live on this planet, whose story of departure from Africa remains one of the most extraordinary in the history of our entire lineage. The discovery of Homo erectus unfolded across several decades and several continents, and the story of how we found them is almost as strange as the species itself. Dutch doctor Eugène Dubois started it in 1891 on the Indonesian island of Java, having done something almost unheard of for a scientist of his era. He had abandoned a medical career and traveled to Southeast Asia specifically to hunt for early human ancestors. His contemporaries thought he was eccentric at best. Before his work, the only early human fossils anyone had ever found were Neanderthal remains, and the idea of something older and more primitive lurking in the human family tree was largely theoretical. What Dubois found in sequence was a tooth, the top of a skull, and a thigh bone. And together those three fragments became Java Man, the first Homo erectus individual ever identified. He named it Pithecanthropus erectus meaning erect ape man, and he was right about its significance, mostly right about its classification, and almost universally ignored. His contemporaries dismissed the fossils as the bones of a deformed ape, and Dubois spent the better part of his remaining career fighting to be taken seriously. The vindication came in China during the 1920s, at a cave system called Zhoukudian, about 30 miles south of Beijing. On a limestone hill locals had named Dragon Bone Hill, Swedish geologist Johan Gunnar Andersson and American paleontologist Walter Granger arrived looking for prehistoric fossils and were led to the site by a local man who knew the bones were there. Excavations running from 1921 through the 1930s eventually produced the teeth, skulls, and bones of approximately 40 individuals, and Canadian anatomist Davidson Black formally identified Peking man as a human ancestor in 1927 on the basis of a single tooth. The volume and quality of those finds finally put Java man in its proper context, establishing that these fossils from Java and China represented the same broad chapter of human evolution. And then the war arrived. By 1941, the Sino-Japanese War had made the Peking man fossils vulnerable enough that researchers packed them for shipment toward a U.S. marine vessel for safekeeping. The fossils never arrived. The original Peking man specimens, among the most scientifically significant physical evidence in the history of human evolution, disappeared in transit and have never been recovered. Casts existed, and the site produced new material after the war ended, but the originals are simply gone, and nobody knows what happened to them. Back in Africa, the most complete early human fossil ever discovered was waiting in the sediment near Lake Turkana in Kenya, where a paleontological team known as the Hominid Gang, led by Kamoya Kimeu, uncovered the skeleton of a young Homo erectus male in the mid-1980s, around 1.5 million years old, and preserved in extraordinary detail. This individual, Turkana boy, or Neriokotome boy, stood 1.6 meters tall at the time of his death, despite being only about 9 years old and nearly fully grown. He remains the most complete ancient human specimen ever discovered. Then came 1991, and the discovery that nobody had seen coming in Georgia. The final day of a dig season has a reputation in paleontology for producing discoveries that upend everything. And Dmanisi in the Republic of Georgia delivered exactly that in 1991, when German graduate student Antje Justus freed the partial skeleton of a saber-toothed cat from the sediment and found a fossilized human jaw lying directly underneath it, complete with a full set of teeth. That jaw, dated to between 1.7 and 1.8 million years ago, stood as the earliest evidence of Homo erectus outside Africa, by a margin that stunned the anthropological community. Anatomically, it bore close resemblance to early African specimens of the same species, and many researchers hadn't expected anything remotely that old to turn up on the other side of the continent. What Dmanisi produced over the following decades was even more arresting. 5 skulls total, recovered from a roughly 100 square foot area on a promontory, 85 kilometers southwest of Tbilisi. Over 100 fossil bones in all, and in 2005, a skull recovered by David Lord Kipanidze, catalogued as D4500, known as Skull 5, turned out to be the most complete skull of any Pleistocene Homo species ever found, and the first complete adult hominin skull of that degree of antiquity anywhere in the record. When the analysis of Skull 5 went public in October 2013, it ignited a scientific argument that hasn't fully resolved. The 5 Dmanisi skulls look strikingly different from each other. Different proportions, different brain sizes, different facial shapes, and under older classification systems, several distinct species might have been named from that material. Analysis showed instead that the variation between those individuals was comparable to what you'd find across a modern human population, or across chimpanzees, which meant that what had been described as half a dozen separate early human species might all have been Homo erectus one highly variable species, all along. Dmanisi also dismantled a narrative that had held for decades. The classical version of the Out of Africa story went like this. Homo erectus developed the advanced Acheulean toolkit, the hand axes and cleavers that represented the major technological leap of their era. And that technology gave them the capability to push into new environments beyond Africa. The Dmanisi individuals departed with simple tools, not the advanced kit, which meant the migration didn't require the technology everyone had assumed it did. And whatever drove them out of Africa in the first place, it wasn't primarily their tools doing the work. And there's one more thread Dmanisi pulled loose that scientists are still arguing about. The residents of that site had brains 1/3 to 1/2 the size of a modern human's. They arrived in the Caucasus 1.8 million years ago, small-brained and simply tooled. And Lord Kipanidze himself raised the possibility that Homo erectus might not have evolved in Africa at all, that the species may have originated in Eurasia and moved back. Most researchers reject that reading, but Dmanisi at least gave it a foundation. Once Homo erectus was out of Africa, the answer to where they went is essentially everywhere reachable on foot. The movement now called Out of Africa 1 Inch, named to distinguish it from the later dispersal of modern Homo sapiens carried Homo erectus across southern Eurasia, through the Middle East, into South Asia, east through China, and down through Southeast Asia into the Indonesian archipelago. African Homo erectus had pushed its range into southern Eurasia by 1.75 million years ago, and by at least 1.6 million years ago, their descendants were established in Southeast Asia. Java held them for over 1 million years, with fossils dating from approximately 1.6 million years ago to at least 250,000 years ago. China saw them until at least 300,000 years ago, with the Pickering Bunn fossils at Zhoukoutian, covering a range from 780,000 to 400,000 years ago. And then in 2018, archaeologists in China uncovered stone tools dating to 2.1 million years ago. Tools that predate the known Homo erectus presence in Africa by enough to seriously complicate the timeline. No fossils were attached to those tools. Nobody knows for certain who made them. What the discovery made clear is that the Out of Africa story is older and more tangled than the current evidence can fully explain. The question of how Homo erectus actually managed this migration is worth sitting with, because there were no maps, no boats, and no organized expeditions. What happened was almost certainly gradual range expansion across generations, populations following food sources, rivers, and animal herds into new territory, each generation moving perhaps just slightly farther than the last. The cumulative drift of thousands of generations adding up to continents. 3 things made it possible. Their bodies first, with those long legs built for distance and a gait efficient enough to cover the poor. Open landscapes that earlier shorter-limbed hominins couldn't exploit as effectively. Their diet second, because Homo erectus ate meat tubers, fruits, seeds, insects, shellfish, and whatever else presented itself, and that dietary range was everything. A specialist can only live where its food lives, while a generalist can survive almost anywhere. Their tools third, because the Acheulean hand axe was the same teardrop shape from Africa to Europe to Asia, and that consistency across such distances tells us something important. The design was being remembered. being taught, being passed across generations as cultural knowledge rather than reinvented at every campsite. Of everything associated with Homo erectus fire stands alone in terms of what it actually changed. Homo erectus appears to have been the first human species to control fire, with evidence pointing toward around 1 million years ago, and some researchers dating early use back to between 1.7 and 2.0 million years ago. Ancient hearths, charcoal deposits, and charred animal bones recovered from Zhoukoudian in China anchor the record, and by around 960,000 years ago, the evidence for regular fire use among Homo erectus era hominins becomes solid. What fire actually meant for a species spreading into unfamiliar climates breaks down into several interlocking advantages. Warmth let them occupy environments that would otherwise have killed them, particularly at night and in colder latitudes. Other animals avoid fire, which reduced predator pressure at camp. Light extended usable hours beyond sunset, and cooking, which breaks down plant matter, denatures proteins, and kills parasites, unlocked nutrients that would otherwise pass through the body unused, which meant a shorter digestive tract could extract more energy from the same food, and that energy went toward the brain. The social dimension matters too. The earliest evidence of hearths suggests campfires were gathering points as much as heat sources, places where groups organized, where the day's events were processed, where something resembling community cohesion took shape around a shared center. Some researchers believe the social dynamics organized around fire contributed to more complex group structures and better cooperation across the span of Homo erectus long existence. By this point, Homo erectus already looks more sophisticated than most people expect. What the most recent discoveries add to that picture is stranger still. In 2025, a survey of the Saknin Valley in Israel turned up more than 200 hand axes, and among them were 10 that stopped researchers entirely. Those tools had been crafted around geological features, fossils embedded in the rock, geodes, hollows resembling miniature caves, concretions forming round ripple-like patterns on the surface, and the maker had deliberately preserved those features rather than napping them away in favor of a cleaner working stone. The researchers who analyzed the tools propose that these objects may have held significance beyond their function, possibly serving as mediators between the maker and the wider cosmos, imbued with meaning that had nothing to do with cutting or scraping. 500,000 years ago, Homo erectus may have been selecting beautiful things for reasons they couldn't have articulated but clearly felt. And a 2025 study looking at Homo erectus behavior in East Africa found that when their home environment dried out and became desert, the response was not collapse but adaptation, visiting water holes that appeared after rain, hunting the animals that congregated to drink, sharpening tools specifically for butchery, and beginning to carry those tools across landscapes rather than fashioning new ones at every stop. Planning ahead, in other words, and treating a good tool as a resource worth protecting, not a disposable object. These are not the behaviors of a creature running on instinct alone. That level of forward planning, combined with the possible selection of stones for aesthetic or symbolic reasons, suggests a mind that was doing considerably more than finding food and avoiding predators. 2 million years of existence, 3 continents occupied, fire controlled and passed down, tools refined across hundreds of thousands of years. And then, in a river valley in central Java, it ended. The last known Homo erectus died in what researchers describe as a mass death event at the site of Enggandong in Indonesia, somewhere between 117,000 and 108,000 years ago, with that window established by a major reanalysis published in 2019. Before that study, some dating had placed Javanese Homo erectus as recently as 27,000 years ago, which would have meant coexistence with modern humans for up to 50,000 years and raised the possibility that our arrival contributed to their end. The new dates ruled that out. Homo erectus was already gone before Homo sapiens reached that region in any meaningful numbers. What killed them was almost certainly the forest. At Ngandong, the environment at the time of that last population was actively changing, open woodland. The kind of habitat Homo erectus had spent 2 million years adapting to and exploiting was giving way to dense rainforest. No Homo erectus fossils appear after that environmental transition, and the interpretation is direct: a species that had survived enormous climatic variation across its long history finally encountered a shift it could not work around. A 2020 study produced statistical evidence that Homo erectus lost more than half of its climatic niche to climate change before disappearing, without any corresponding reduction in the physical territory it occupied. The range was still there, the niche inside it was gone. Australian National University researcher Dr. Sari Shipton added a behavioral dimension to the extinction question, finding evidence across Homo erectus sites in the Arabian Peninsula of what he called least-effort strategies, collecting stone from nearby sources even when better materials sat available at greater distances, making minimal modifications to tools, not innovating when circumstances might have rewarded innovation. They really don't seem to have been pushing themselves, Shipton told reporters. I don't get the sense they were explorers looking over the horizon. That pattern of behavioral conservatism, combined with a climate that stopped cooperating, appears to have been enough. The Homo erectus story is not a closed case. New material keeps surfacing, sometimes literally. In May 2025, fossils recovered from the seabed of the Madura Strait in Indonesia came from what was once a river valley, land that now sits underwater, dating to approximately 140,000 years ago. Those fossils revealed that Homo erectus had lived across the lowlands of a region called Sundaland during periods of lower sea levels, and that the late Javanese population was actively hunting large, healthy bovids, a behavior not previously documented in that population and one that may reflect contact with other hominin groups on the Asian mainland. Harold Bergius of Leiden University, who led the excavation, described the find as truly unique, given its origin in a drowned river valley. December 2025 brought a digital reconstruction of a 1.5 million-year-old Homo erectus face from Ethiopia, and what emerged was unexpectedly primitive. The brain case matched classic Homo erectus but the facial structure was different enough to push researchers back to the question of where and how the species actually emerged. And in January 2026, a new analysis of the Dmanisi skulls from Georgia suggested that Homo erectus may not have been the only hominin species departing Africa 1.8 million years ago, that a more primitive group may have already been in Georgia at the same time, making the Out of Africa story not a single event, but something more complicated and layered than a single species crossing a single threshold. If that interpretation holds, the opening chapter of the entire migration narrative needs rewriting. The fossil record for Homo erectus is by any measure both larger and more complicated than the record for any other early human species, and every few years something new emerges from the ground, or, as 2025 demonstrated, from the ocean floor, and shifts what the previous generation of scientists thought they had settled. So let's return to where this started. Homo erectus the first humans to leave Africa, appeared around 2 million years ago, survived for nearly that entire span, and crossed from one continent to 3 carrying simple tools and a brain considerably smaller than ours. They controlled fire. They may have selected fossil-embedded rocks for reasons that had nothing to do with utility, They adapted to deserts, woodlands, river valleys, and coastal lowlands across a range that stretched from East Africa to the Indonesian seabed. And when the open woodland finally closed around the last of them in Java, between 117,000 and 108,000 years ago, they left behind a record that scientists are still actively excavating, redating, and arguing over in 2026. Ashley Hammond of the American Museum of Natural History framed it cleanly. Homo erectus is the first hominin that we know about that has a body plan more like our own and seemed to be on its way to being more human-like. On their way to being us. Nearly 2 million years on that road and still not finished when the forest came. That's the thing about Homo erectus that no summary quite captures. They weren't a rough draft, they were a full, long, complicated story of their own, one that researchers keep having to revise as new material comes out of the earth. And that, more than anything else about them, is what makes their story worth telling.